Good morning, everyone, and good evening, Frank. Um, Welcome to the CGPP Friday seminar. My name is Kai He. I'm the director of the Center for Governance and Public Policy at Griffith. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land on which my colleagues and I stand today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Frank Baumgartner. Professor Baumgartner holds the Richard Richardson Distinguished Professorship in the Political Science Department at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is one of the country's leading scholars on the policy process, and with Brian Jones developed the punctuated equilibrium theory of policy change, a widely used concept in the political science field. His work was most focused on the US, but many publications have used comparative perspective. I still remember I know the concept of punctuated equilibrium theory in my comparative politics seminar in the States. So in recent years, he has focused on the statistical studies on the criminal justice issues, including the death penalty, racial disparity in the traffic stop outcomes, and other issues. His most recent co-author book is the Dynamics of the Public Opinion by Cambridge in 2021. His 2008 co-authored book on the racial and the criminal justice is Suspect Citizens, also published by Cambridge, focusing on racial difference in the outcomes of routine traffic stops. His book was recognized with the Best Book Award by the Law and the Court sections of the American Political Science Association in 2019. He's currently working on a number of projects relating to race and the criminal justice outcomes. Today, Professor Baumgartner will give us a talk for around 30 to 40 minutes, and his talk is entitled Using Traffic Stops to Fight the War on Crime, High Racial Equity Cost, Low Public Safety Value. Then after the talk, we will start a Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to let me know. Thank you. And without further ado, Frank, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And let me say I'm really pleased to be at Griffith University, and I feel like I'm traveling in time speaking to you tomorrow from my perspective here today on March 31st. And also thank you for adjusting your schedules to make adjustments for this time difference. So I really appreciate that. I know it's inconvenient. I want to talk about something that's the most common form of interaction between Americans and their police officers, which is the routine traffic stop. And to discuss something about these traffic stops that to me is quite troubling, and also as a public policy scholar, also quite puzzling. And so the puzzle is why they do it. And I think the answer is quite difficult to accept. So let me talk a little bit about the high racial cost, the racial equity cost of traffic stops, and the low public safety value that they have. So that's what I want to discuss with you today. What I want to talk about, a little bit of background, is the law that was passed in our state, North Carolina, in 1999, which was the first law of its kind in the United States to mandate the collection of data on every traffic stop in the state. I want to talk a little bit about the legal background associated with traffic stops, and then discuss with you a few key findings that I've had with various co-authors, mostly students, analyzing large data sets that come from state agencies around the country, mostly North Carolina, but in other states as well. And then draw your attention to this political puzzle. Why do we do these policies when they have so little public safety value? And then maybe open up a discussion about where we stand today on the issue of racial disparities and police interactions with citizens. So to start with something quite simple, and which goes back to my own intellectual roots, the first thing I was interested in this question, in this topic, was when did this issue become a high agenda item on the political agenda? And it turns out that by reviewing newspaper stories about the topic of quote unquote driving while black, it was in the late 1990s that there was a surge of attention to this issue. And North Carolina was the first, and the chart that I'm showing you there simply reflects 3 different ways of measuring the same concept, which is how many newspaper stories were there on this topic. And no matter which way we measure, we use different sets of keywords. We find different levels of coverage, but similar patterns, that there was a surge of attention around the late 1990s. So North Carolina passed a law in 1999 mandating the collection of traffic stops. And it was interesting because there had been legislation proposed at the national level to mandate exactly the same thing, but it has never gone anywhere, partly because of racial politics in the U.S. Congress, but also because of the U.S. System of federalism and police departments are local functions. So there was also an investigative reporter, a journalistic investigation into the problems of racial disparities in traffic stops in our local newspaper. And our state legislators, who were African American themselves, got behind this issue, and they told their personal stories about their experiences with the police. And that generated a consensus, a bipartisan consensus, that we should ask the police to collect this data, and then an expectation that it would either exonerate the police from wrongful accusations of racial bias, or it would validate the accusations and generate immediate responses by the police. And I would say that was a very hopeful and oversimplistic expectation in 1999, but that was, I think, the expectation. After the law was passed and extended to every police department in the entire state, no one ever looked at the data, which was quite interesting. And I think also a reminder about the importance of follow-up and implementation after the passage of any important legislation. So in 2001, I was asked to volunteer with a citizen advisory group advising a group of civil rights attorneys at the state level to analyze the data. So I did that, and I had no experience with this particular kind of data set, and it was a very complicated and logistically difficult data set to work with, but eventually we figured it out, and 7 years later we were able to publish a book about it. A little bit of background, I was unaware of this, and it's quite surprising, but in the 1960s and 70s, there developed a new mechanism or accepted truth in the world of policing that we could use the kind of psychological profiling mechanism in order to isolate who might be what you would think of as a drug courier, somebody who might be transporting large quantities of drugs from one community to another. And actually, it's very interesting, this literature within the police community stemmed from, for those of you who are old enough to remember, it stemmed from the psychological profiling to identify who might be an aircraft hijacker. Back in the 60s and early 70s, there had been a fair number of airplane hijackings, and the FBI and other police agencies were quite concerned about figuring out who might be a hijacker. And this was before, of course, all the security reforms that we've all had to suffer through every airport internationally. But that was translated into the world of traffic stops, where police officers thought that they could establish a profile. And one of the things in this profile was the idea that you could use traffic stops as a filtering mechanism to stop and interrogate thousands and thousands of people with the hope of identifying a small percentage of those people who might be engaged in some kind of criminal activity. And the most common criminal activity that the police were looking for was transporting illegal goods, particularly contraband narcotics. From the beginning, the police understood that this was a very low yield proposition. It was kind of a needle in the haystack type of strategy. But luckily for the police, there were two things going for them, legally and politically. Legally, every driver is violating the law. The number of traffic laws and vehicle codes is enormous. And so anyone who's driving a car is breaking some part of the traffic code, if not the vehicle code. And the other thing is that white middle class drivers are not subject to these kinds of intrusions into their privacy. So people with strong political power are exempt from these policies, and people with low political power are subjected to them. There was a particular police officer, and you could call him a policy entrepreneur, who developed a strategy of targeting minority male drivers, particularly younger men of color, who were driving in his jurisdiction, who he thought might fit the profile of what he thought of as the stereotype of a drug courier. And he saw that stereotype as Hispanic men and African American men under the age of 40 or so. And when he described that profile to judges in court after he arrested people for the possession of drugs, the judges didn't accept that justification for the traffic stop, and many of his traffic stops were thrown out as illegal racial profiling. So, not to be deterred, he went and studied the law books in California, and he came up with the idea that, well, first, I need to identify a legally permissible reason to stop this person, and then after that, I have the ability to pull them over. So he found hundreds and hundreds of legally valid pretexts that he could use to pull people over. And this became standard practice throughout the United States, and I'm sure in other countries. This is something that is still in progress and is not included in my book, but I've been looking with a student about the origins of the traffic laws, and in fact, in our state, North Carolina, they date from the late 1930s, and I think they actually were intended to restrict the mobility of African American drivers. This is something that's still in progress, but I think not only do we see discriminatory or disparate impact on African American and minority drivers, but we see an actual discriminatory intent of the legislature to pass laws that would allow the police to do this kind of thing. I want to mention a couple background pieces of literature that are quite recent. One is a fantastic recent book that's also a film that one can watch called Driving While Black. And it highlights the fact that in the period when the automobile was being widely adopted, it was adopted differentially and more enthusiastically by African Americans than by whites. And that might be surprising, but controlling for their income levels, if African Americans could afford a car, they were very quick to purchase cars and use them, partly because they provided them relief from the humiliation of traveling on public accommodations, which were segregated and terrible for African American passengers on buses and trains. So it became a big part of the Black political culture to assign high values to cars. Another book that is very interesting and recent is how the law was transformed by the widespread adoption of cars. And in particular, the courts had to make this distinction or decision or come to a conclusion on this question that was a novel question, which is your car similar to your home where you have the expectation of privacy? Or is your car similar to the public sidewalk where you might be a pedestrian walking down the street where you have some expectation of privacy, but not as much as in your home? Or is your car something different? And the answer is your car is a crime scene. You have no expectation of privacy in your car because if you're driving a car, you're breaking a law. And that's a quite shocking way of thinking about the automobile and its impact on police powers over citizens. But I think it's something that we should all recognize as true. Now, the reason why it's not widely recognized is it's not applicable to middle-class white Americans. It only applies, practically speaking, to people who have some disadvantage with regards to law enforcement. So that brings me to this question: what is a traffic stop? Is a traffic stop a validation or a sanction for some kind of problem in your driving? Or is a traffic stop the opportunity for the police officer to have a conversation with you because he's suspicious of what you might be doing or who you are? And for me, I should say I'm a white middle-class college professor of a certain age, and I don't fit the profile. So for me, a traffic stop is a sanction for bad driving. And I'm a pretty good driver, but not a particularly fantastic one, but I haven't been pulled over in 25 years. So that gives a sense of the implementation of these laws. Whereas people who fit what the police think of as the criminal profile, that is young men of color, might be pulled over many, many times. So in minority communities, people understand that traffic stops and police interactions are often unfair and used as pretexts for a conversation. That's an invasion of privacy. And in white middle-class communities in the United States, this tends to be considered incomprehensible or otherworldly or not possible because it just doesn't happen to people who are white middle class like myself. So to give a very quick summary of some empirical results, what we found after analyzing over 20 million traffic stops in a single state over about 15 to 20 years was that black drivers were about twice as likely as white drivers to be pulled over. That when they were pulled over, after they were pulled over, they were about twice as likely to see their car subjected to search compared to white drivers. That the typical result of that search was nothing was found. If something was found, which was in about only 30% of the 25 to 30% of the cases of a search is there contraband. And then typically that contraband is a very small amount, so that only 40% of people with contraband are in fact arrested. So this suggests the very low public safety value of these policies. And then the disparities are ubiquitous across every state and locality where we've been able to study, and also quite clearly based on visible stereotypes. And whatever database we use, if there's another indicator of a visible stereotype, we always find that visible stereotype correlates with a higher likelihood of search of the car. To go into a little bit of data very quickly, North Carolina, our state has a population of about 10 million people, and we have anywhere from 1 to 1.7 million traffic stops per year. So when you put that into the context of the size of our population, it's actually quite a lot of traffic stops. 10 to 15, almost 20% of the population might experience a traffic stop in a given year. And of course, over several years, most people would be subject to a traffic stop. We also can see very clearly that there's dramatic differences in traffic stops based on your combined race and gender. And here I've simplified race and gender to just 4 categories: white, black, male, and female. In North Carolina, black males are about 11% of the population, but they're about 20% of the traffic stops, so they're overrepresented by a factor of 2. But we also can see that our form where they list the traffic stops indicates why the car was pulled over, and we can separate out the traffic stops for traffic safety purposes, such as speeding and running through stop signs, versus other reasons, such as having expired registration tags or equipment problems, such as broken tail light or other problems. And we see very stark differences in what type of driver gets pulled over for what type of cause. And the people who fit the stereotype of the criminal are more likely to be pulled over for reasons that it's easy to see might be more likely to be pretextual reasons rather than reasons about keeping the road safe for the next driver. Black males are searched at a much higher rate. It's not a high rate. It's only about it's about 8%, 6-8% of all traffic stops lead to a search for black males. Statewide, that number is less than 3%. So 97% of traffic stops are just traffic stops. They don't lead to the search of the vehicle, but there's a small percentage that do lead to search, which is a clear indicator that the officer believes that the driver might be doing something illegal or have in his property, in his possession, some kind of illegal contraband. And you can see from the chart on the left that that's highly correlated with race and gender. White males come in second, so this is a very gendered policy. And then black females and white females are much less likely to be subjected to search. But when we look at the percent of traffic stops that lead to not only a search, but also to the discovery of contraband, and not only to the discovery of contraband, but also the arrest of the driver, we find that 99.5% of traffic stops do not lead to an arrest. So this is a very, very small share of traffic stops that lead to the discovery of contraband significant enough to lead to the arrest of the driver. And that is also racialized and gendered, as you might imagine. Particularly, it's both gendered, highly gendered, and highly racialized. These charts are difficult to read, but they simply present the number of traffic stops, the percent of stops that are oriented towards traffic safety, the percent of traffic stops that lead to a citation rather than a warning, the percent that lead to search, and the percent that lead to arrest over the hours of the week, so that we can compare the early morning rush hour on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, to the late evening on the weekends. And you can see very clear and consistent patterns. Those are difficult to read, so on the next slide, I eliminate the week, the day of the week, and just look at the hour of the day. And this is a little bit easier to see. The number of traffic stops is quite high around midnight. It's actually at its peak around 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, when very few drivers are actually on the road that late at night. That's when the traffic stops occur. Very few traffic stops occur at 4, 5, 6, 7 a.m. And then we see dramatic differences in the percentage of stops that relate to traffic safety, that's speeding and running through stop signs. And then at the bottom, you can see the percent of the stops that lead to search and arrest. And those are very clearly associated with the time of day. So they're associated with time of day. Policing changes during the daylight hours from what it looks like during the nighttime hours. And it shifts from emphasizing traffic safety to fighting the war on drugs. Here we just look at the odds that your car will be searched after a traffic stop compared to by your race and gender and your age. And this is no surprise, although I should say it's the only time I've ever had a bar chart republished in the front page of the New York Times. This chart was reproduced there, which was quite interesting. Anyway, the profile is that you're a young black male. And if you are a young man of color, you have a significantly higher chance that the officer will see you with some suspicion. Now, I should say that white men are also the object of considerable suspicion, especially when they're under the age of 25 or 30. And then among women, there's very little racial difference. Women don't fit the profile from the police officer's perspective of the drug courier or criminal stereotype. It's a male phenomenon. This is one of several graphs I could present to you that just shows that the amount of contraband that's seized when there is a contraband discovery is almost always trivial. And in this particular graph, I'm showing you the number of ounces of contraband seized if the contraband is measured in ounces or weight. And so it's very rare that there be a large seizure. So when we think about the public safety benefit or the crime fighting benefit of these policies, it's important to consider, are we finding minnows or are we finding whales? And we're finding minnows, not whales, in these policies. And we're not finding that many minnows either. We've extended this research as far as we possibly can into other states, and I want to address just one aspect of that. One of the things that we look at is the simple ratio between the search rate for the black driver and the search rate for the white driver. And then in our book, we go through an extensive effort to control for all the possible predictor variables that could have generated that racial disparity in the simple search rate comparison. And we do a logistic regression predicting the odds of search, controlling for everything available in the database, including the officer ID, fixed effects for officers, fixed effects for agencies, time of day, day of week, why they were pulled over, the age of the driver. And we find that the simple search rate ratio correlates very, very strongly with the more complicated and statistically valid logistic regression odds ratio. So very little is explained away by the other factors. And in this simple chart, I show the difference between the search rate ratio, the simple comparison of the two search rates, with the logistic regression odds ratio using the most complete logistic regression we can do in that state. And you can see that they correspond very, very strongly. And you can also see that, I think 98 or 99% of all the observations fall to the right or to the north of 1.0. 1.0 would be the rate at which white and black drivers are searched at equal rates. Almost all the observations show a disparity to the disadvantage of the minority driver. And that's true whether we look at the simple comparison of rates or the more complicated odds ratios. I could tell you that having done this research now and presented it for many years, there's been a variety of responses from our police partners. It's kind of like the stages of grief, I think. when we first presented, there was a response of anger and denial, very strong response. And our local police agencies got together and through their professional associations hired a consultant to try to critique and take down my research. Stage 2, I think, was an admission of the fact, but a denial of the cause of the disparities, and a suggestion that perhaps it's due to educational differences or housing differences or other differences that are part of American history and society, but not the fault of the police. Stage 3 has been into some real consideration of maybe there's something to this after all, and maybe there's ways that the police could move to make reforms. And I think stage 4 is the possibility of some structural changes. I would say we're not very far into stage 3 yet, although many cities are seriously looking into their policies and asking themselves serious questions about whether it's worth it, whether they're getting a lot of public safety benefit, because they know that they're suffering some public relations deficits and some public community relations animosity associated with these policies. So they're wondering, is it worth it? Are they getting bang for the buck? And then the next stage we're not really very far into, which is structural reforms, such as separating out the traffic function from the criminal control function of the police. And I want to end with just a couple observations. One is that one of the funniest or most revealing conversations I've had with members of the community in presenting this research was an older black man literally asked me the question that I quote there at the top: "Professor, with all due respect, do they actually pay you to do this? Because everybody already knows this." And he was contradicted immediately by an older white woman who said that she had no idea that any of this was even possible. And it really revealed the disparities that we have as Americans and how we live and interact with the police based on our identities. So I will stop there and open myself up to your questions, and I hope that you have many of them.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Really appreciate it. Okay, any question? Oh, yes, I see. Sophia, please.